back to our Big Woods Hard Question series, where we have taken your questions in the Bible, theology, and how to live as a Christian, and we've attempted to discuss and dialogue on them. This will actually be our last episode of the series, and we have an awesome question saved for today. We've actually received multiple questions on the same subject, so we're going to try and tackle all of them at once. Our question for today is, what happens after we die? The Bible seems to have several answers that don't fit together on this subject. Now, one thing I think we should point out is that we may not have as much information on this subject as we like. Although the Bible is sufficient for us in our sanctification, our becoming more like Christ, allowing us to be complete and equipped for every good work, we are never promised that it will answer every possible question to the completeness that we may desire. But the Bible certainly gives us at least a brief picture of the subject. So let's first get on to an overview of the Bible's teaching on this. And I'm going to try and be thorough about it before we lay the answer out. So let's dive on into it. The Old Testament actually doesn't mention much about the afterlife. The Old Testament often gives references such as being gathered to his people when Aaron, Moses' brother and high priest, died in Numbers 20:24, or when God spoke to Moses about his own death in Deuteronomy 32:50. Phrasing similar to this continues later in the Old Testament in passages such as 1 Kings 2:10 or 2 Kings 16:20, where various kings are described after death as having slept with his fathers. Now, although some have suggested this is referring to burial, that is very unlikely. Aaron and Moses were buried away from their own families, away from their people. And in the Kings passages, burial is mentioned separately, generally about one line down. Most likely, these phrases like being gathered to his people, or slept with his fathers, is reference to the realm of the dead. This realm is likely referenced again in Psalm 49:19. His soul will go out to the generation of his fathers. This realm is sometimes referred to in the Hebrew name Sheol. The inhabitants of Sheol seem to have to some degree a post-mortem existence, as hinted at in prohibitions against necromancy and mediums in the Old Testament. This is best confirmed in 1 Samuel 28. A narrative about King Saul visiting a medium to summon the spirit of Samuel. Now, God actually allows this to work. And when the spirit of Samuel comes up, he actually calls out Saul on his own sin. Now, that's in the Old Testament. When we begin to look at the New Testament, we have a better picture on the subject. Remember, the New Testament is written after the Old Testament. Sometimes topics which are only partially explained in the Old Testament are more fully explained in the New Testament. This concept is called by biblical scholars progressive revelation. That as revelation progresses, as we are given more information by God throughout biblical history, throughout the Bible, some topics become more clear as we are given more information. Now, if I had to summarize the New Testament's teaching on what happens after we die, I would say we have our afterlife, then our life abundant. What do I mean by this? Okay, let's dive on into the New Testament and figure it out. Jesus seems to support the idea of an intermediate state, an afterlife where we exist spiritually, in numerous passages. Luke 20:37-39, he indicates that the deceased patriarchs are alive to God. In Matthew 10:28, he gives counsel to not fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both the soul and body in hell. In Luke 16:19-31, it contains a long parable about Lazarus and the rich man who's never named, which seems to indicate an intermediate state, potentially even for those who are non-believers. Now, although there is little evidence for an intermediate state for those who are non-believers, largely being limited to Luke 16, there is considerable evidence from the previous passages mentioned for an intermediate state for those who are followers of Christ. But the strongest evidence comes from these following three passages. In Luke 23:43, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, the criminal beside him expresses faith in him, to which Jesus replies, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Philippians 1:21-24 gives a strong indicator of the intermediate state. "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." Paul gives similar teachings in 2 Corinthians 5, 6-9. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage and would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. To summarize all of this, when we die, we enter in, as Jesus describes it, paradise with him that very day. This intermediate state is one in which we are without a body. It is a place where we are with Christ and it is good. Paul even describes it as far better than our current life. In my early summary, Afterlife then Life Abundant, this is the afterlife, the temporary spiritual state where we are with Christ immediately after death. This intermediate state is most likely in heaven, as referenced from Revelation 6:9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. Remember, this vision of John's is occurring in heaven. Now, to tackle some of the parts that seem to sort of conflict. How does passages like 1 Thessalonians 4, 13-18, and the last few chapters of Revelation play into this? These passages point towards our final destination. Remember, the intermediate state is temporary, as I said. Our final destination as believers. What I would call life abundant. At the end of the world as we know it, God will come and all people will be judged, as stated in Revelation 20, 11-13. This is when those who have previously died will be resurrected. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Those who did not have a relationship with Christ will be sent to hell, as described as a lake of fire in Revelation 20:15. But if we do have a relationship with Christ, if we trust him as our Lord and Savior, you will both see the recreation and enter into the new earth, as described in Revelation 21:20. When there, we will be given renewed bodies, as described in 2 Corinthians 5, 1-5. They're described sometimes as heavenly dwellings, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Our existence will then be in the new earth, living in the presence of God. It's actually described in sort of similar ways to a pre-fall Garden of Eden. But rather than a garden, it's an entire city. So now in summary, the Old Testament speaks very little about the afterlife, but it does indicate the continued spiritual existence of the dead. Our understanding of the spiritual existence of the dead is expanded in the New Testament in much more detail. And with that, I would have to answer the question, what happens after we die? We have the afterlife, then life abundant. Let me explain. We recognize that as believers, when we die, we are with Christ immediately, which is described as far better than our current lives. We exist in this intermediate state as spirit, but it is only temporary. At judgment, at the end of the world as we know it, those who have a saving relationship with Christ are given new bodies, and we live within God's presence in the new earth. And that's going to be our existence for the rest of eternity. Hence, after the afterlife, our life abundant. The Bible does not have conflicting information about what happens after we die. Rather, it gives us a very brief picture of both the intermediate state and our eternal state after death. As followers of Christ, we have nothing to fear from death. We are then able to immediately be with Christ, and we can look forward to being with God in the new earth after the day of judgment. This doesn't take away from the horror of death at all, though. Death is still a painful reminder of sin being in this world. But Christ has been and is victorious over it. Hence why we can sing from 1 Corinthians 15, 54-55. Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Thank you for joining us for our Hard Questions series. Even though the series is finished, please always feel free to ask or email questions into myself or any of the other elders or pastors. One of my absolute favorite things is when a student comes to me and asks a question about the Bible or following God. So questions are always welcome. We love you, Bigwoods, and we can't wait to see you again in person. I'll see you.